Romans 10:4 has another one of those commonly poorly translated and misunderstood words within Paul's epistles, which very diversely affects the understanding and the expository context of the scriptures. As it says in the King James Version, and probably your translation as well in English, it says, "For Christ is the end of the law," the Torah, "for righteousness for those who believe," for everyone who believes, actually, is what it says here. So it sure sounds as if that law, that Torah, is put to an end if you believe in Jesus, aka Yeshua. And you're no longer to establish righteousness or determine righteousness based upon that law. If we take that literal interpretation from the English, if it's an accurate and the only way to translate it, it sure seems as if Jesus, aka Yeshua, literally put an end to the Torah. Which would mean that he put an end to the Sabbaths. Yea, many would say, the land rests, or we say the Shemitah years, the Jubilee year on the 50th of every 50-year cycle. Well, rather than just cherry pick which ones we want to put an end to, how about all 10 of those big words, commandments? Now, of course, most Christians would say 9 of those 10s, well, we shouldn't put an end to those. Why just one out of all of those 10 that he actually made holy, the Sabbath day, over 2,000 years before the Jewish people ever existed? Way back in the book of Genesis, Bereshit, as we say, the creation week. Wow, we see these commandments existed. So rather than just cherry pick, let's try to understand Paul accurately and realize that in the context of Romans chapter 10, he's actually quoting Moses, Moshe, in positive ways, not in a negative way to put an end to Moshe or his writings, but in positive ways. Let's go to the context. If we just go to verses 5 and 6, rather than in negative ways, we see, and he's not speaking against or abolishing what the Most High told Moses to write down. Moses, I call him Moses the meekest, because wasn't he the meekest on the earth at that time? Very meek. He didn't want the job. He was writing down what the Most High told him to write down. It wasn't his own words or his own commandments. But let's take a look at this. As Paul quotes, notice how he references Moses here in verses 5 and 6. And I quote, "For Moses," Moshe, "writes about the righteousness which is of the law," the righteousness which is of the Torah. And here he quotes it, "The man who does those things shall live by them." Now that's quoting Leviticus chapter 18, and I'll go to that in a second. But let me go to verse 6 here of Romans chapter 10. It says, "But the righteousness of faith," here's the righteousness of faith, "speaks in this way." Well, how does the righteousness of faith speak? He says, "Do not say in your heart, 'Who will ascend into heaven?'" That is, to bring Christ down from above. And he's quoting Deuteronomy 30, chapter 11 and 14. So let's go to these two sections where Paul is quoting. First, let's go to Leviticus 18, verses 5 and 6 here. It says, "You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am the holy name here, the Yud He Vav He. Well, verse 6 here. None of you shall approach one who is near of kin to him to uncover the nakedness. I am that holy name. And he goes on to explain laws of sexual immorality, incest, and else as well. So you can read that context, and most Christians wouldn't say, oh, well, you know, when we say, if a man does them, he shall live by them, he's actually encouraging us to keep these commandments and to live by them, as most Christians would agree in defining sexual immorality here as the context, the expository context of Leviticus 18. Now, you know, verse 6 of Romans 10, he's quoting just a section of Deuteronomy, and often we see this in the Brit Hadashah writings. When they quote just a little bit of it, the author, the writer, is expecting you to go back and read the context, or at least know the context. Like when Yeshua was on being crucified, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's wanting you to go back to Psalms 22 and read it, about the piercings of the hands and so forth, to be the crimson worm, as it says in the context. And I have a YouTube video teaching on the crimson worm of Psalms 22. I encourage you to read it, and it'll blow your mind, and your faith will be very zealous and excited to hear the interpretation and the understanding of that. But I don't want to go too deep into that. But he's quoting these chapters here. So let's go to Deuteronomy, where he says, who will ascend into heaven? Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 through 14. Contrary to popular belief within much of Christianity today, it says, for this commandment, and often the word singular, when it says mitzvah or commandment, it's referring to all, and you can go back to the context. I don't want to go too much context here, but it's talking about all the commandments, not just one, but it lumps it all up into one great commandment. All of them do. And he says, for this commandment which I command to you today is not too mysterious. It's not too difficult. In other words, for you, it is not too far off somewhere. It is not up in heaven only, as I might say, that you should say, who will ascend up into heaven and for us and bring it down to us, that we may hear it and we may do it. So in other words, you don't have to travel. He says, nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us to bring it to us. So, well, who's going to go to this huge schooling here? You know, we can talk about man's form of education. I don't mean to put it down, but you don't need to go to some special seminary or yeshiva school just to understand the basics of the Torah here. It's not too mysterious. It's not too difficult, is what we see in the context here. Nor is it beyond the sea, but the word is very near to you. Verse 14. In your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. And of course, with the Brit Hadashah, the new covenant, as we read about in Jeremiah 31:31 through 33, it needs to be written in our hearts. And there's a new spirit that's promised that will help circumcise our hearts, and it'll become even easier, and they will not be burdensome. As we read in the book of John, 1 John, I think 5, verses 2 and 3, that his commandments are not burdensome. Now, mankind likes to add a lot of commandments and traditions and doctrines of men, and maybe a fence around it to make it too strict, and that causes people, many just throw the baby out with the bathwater And unfortunately, but if you want to keep ultra strict commandments for yourself, I'm not going to insult you or condemn you or judge you on these things, but be careful not to expect others to reach higher standards than what we see in the basics, the simplicity of the Word of God here. So, getting back to it, and back to Romans chapter 10, verse 4, if we carefully, aside from the context, which I just expounded upon, how he's quoting Moshe in positive ways to keep the commandments, not put an end to them, let's go and examine carefully the key original Greek word that has been preserved in the Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant writings, the New Testament, as many people refer to it as, and compare these key words. Let's do a little bit of exegesis, as we say in Christianity, and in Judaism we would say the ramez, and also we need to look at the drash. I've looked a little bit at the drash, the context, but let's see how these words are used elsewhere, the same Greek word, key Greek word, and I'm going to use the Strong's Concordance a little bit here. And I know the Strong's Concordance is not perfect. Let me just say that up front, that it uses Old English words like this word "end" of the law, and it uses Old English words in translation which really shouldn't be used in modern English today, and that makes it a little difficult. We also got at point number 2, we got to realize that the European Christian scholarship, which translated the King James Version, a lot of our versions are either American or European. Hebrew was not their native tongue, and ancient Greek wasn't their native tongue either, but they do have their doctorate's degrees, or there's also rabbis' degrees for the Hebrew and the Torah, and to be rabbis, or doctorate's degrees. If you're Christian, you want a doctorate's degree. But still, we got to look at the native tongue today is not these old ancient languages, but we can look at these words and see the different ways to translate them accurately, and look at the context and try to understand it a little more accurately, and which is what I'm going to do with you here. But point number 3, also the Strong's Concordance is a little biased in theology, just like all translations are. A little biased here and there. So that's why we got to get back to the words here that have been preserved and see how they're used elsewhere, and see what's unified with the entire context of the whole book here, to bring unity, not division or divisiveness in schisms, but to bring unity here. Some positive things I'll say about the Strong's Concordance, or the King James Version, is more of a literal interpretation of the original words, which isn't perfect always. Sometimes you have to translate the meaning, but more literal interpretation can help us find a little more accuracy, because once you become to interpret the meaning, then obviously the theological bias comes into the interpretation a lot more. So I like the literal interpretation, and then double check up on the literal interpretation of the Hebrew and the Greek words, depending on which half of the scriptures we're reading from, and the original sources that we can track down, the original words and language, I should say. So the King James has an organized collection, very organized, easy to check up for your basic common folks out there. It's not too difficult and complicated. You don't have to be highly educated and have some bachelor's or doctorate's degree to use a Strong's Concordance, and so depending on the degree of the accuracy of the manuscripts that have been preserved, then we can find the degree of accuracy of interpretation and the diverse ways to interpret as well. Point number 3, and positive with the Strong's Concordance, is that we do have some confirmed Hebrew New Testament Brit Hadashah writings, like the Shem Tov version of Matthew, and I have other teachings on that. You can Google search that, Shem Tov, Tov with a V or with a B. You could say Shem Tov, or Shem Tov, and Matthew. Just Google search that. And there's a Karaite Jew, Nehemiah Gordon, who does a 2-hour presentation with a PowerPoint presentation to really show how this book had to have been written in Hebrew first, with the Hebrewisms that just can't seem to translate into Greek accurately. And it brings unity with Yeshua's teachings, not contradictions. So anyway, just say that real quickly without going too much into detail. So, but the Strong's Concordance is easiest in comparing with other translations, but you have to have the Strong's to see the words to look up, like you're looking up definitions of words in alphabetical order. And it's also compatible with most lexicons out there. So if you want to see where that same word is being used in other scriptures, whether it be Greek or Hebrew, the lexicons will give you even more, because words can be translated with different words in English. So it's kind of hard with the Strong's. You're limited. The lexicons can help you find more, but they're often compatible with Strong's. They'll give you just the Strong's number. So if you have the Strong's, you can compare the two with a little more accuracy. Also, the Strong's establishes credibility with most Christians out there. So if it's in compliant, it's more power to us for finding accuracy. So moving on here, this Greek word that's used for end in Romans chapter 10 verse 4 is Strong's number 5056. 5056, it's transliterated something like teleos, which can mean, here's what Strong says, it can mean to set out for a definite point or goal. So a point could be like a bullseye, like a dot, a point or a goal, which the point aimed at as a limit. So this is your limit. How far can you go? How for perfection? Here's the bullseye. Here's the end. The limitation is perfection, hitting that bullseye. I'm paraphrasing there, but let me go back to the quote here. To set out for a definite point or goal, the point aimed at as a limit, comma, end. So end is an accurate possible translation, END, uttermost conclusion. More words, synonymous words to translate this word for teleos. So it can mean end, as most translations say, but it doesn't fit the context. If he is the goal, the bullseye, the aim for perfection, if you get to that bullseye, then you have no more improvement left for you. You're keeping Torah perfectly, just as he did. WWJD, what would Jesus do? He kept the Torah perfectly. And so he is the goal. And now don't just believe my words. Let's go to some other scriptures where the same Greek word is used. If we want to have faith in him for salvation, we have to see the same Greek word used. For example, in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, it says, now the purpose, here's that Greek word, teleos, doesn't say end, doesn't say now the end of the commandment is love. Now the Old King James does say the end of the commandment. Remember, singular can also mean plural. When we're talking about commandment, it can also encompass all the commandments as subdivisions of the commandment. We say the golden rule is to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, when you're loving your neighbor, you're also loving him, the Creator, the Most High. And they are synonymous. So we're not just saying two commandments only or one commandment. Sometimes they can refer to all. As even Yeshua says in the Gospels that it all hangs on two commandments, loving him, he quotes the Shema, and loving your neighbor as yourself. Hillel, before that, also said that the whole Torah is based upon loving your neighbor as yourself. And so Anyway, a little bit of evidence from some quotes. Don't want to go into too much detail, but notice here in 1 Timothy 1:5 it says, "Now the purpose of the commandment is love." Is love from a pure heart. Love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith. See, not faith without works, but faith with obedience here, the commandment. Now, it doesn't seem logical to say that the end of the commandment is love. You put an end to the law, and now all of a sudden you've got all this love because you've put an end to it. That's one way people can look at that, but it's not logical. Most people wouldn't interpret it that way. The New King James has cleaned that translation up a little bit compared to the older version. So he didn't put an end or a literal end to any commandment in regard to obedience. At least we don't see any evidence here. So he is the target. He is the target not to make void any of the commandments, but to shoot for his righteousness, his character, which was without spot, without wrinkle, that perfect sacrifice. So Torah commandments teach us how to love him first. He's put, for example, Matthew. If you don't believe he taught that, go to Mattisyahu, chapter 22, read verses 36 through 40. And other places in the gospel, that's just one example where he said, to fulfill the Torah, you are loving him first and you're loving your neighbor. It's all based, the whole law and the prophets, not just the Torah, but the prophets are based upon those two great commandments. Now, James chapter 5. James 5:11, and we say Yaakov, who is his first century name. It says, "Indeed, we count them blessed who endure." Endure with what? Well, he says, "You have heard of the perseverance of Job." In the book of Job, most of us know that story. "And seen the end," here's that Greek word, end, teleos, intended by the Most High here, the Holy One. That he is very compassionate. He is very compassionate and merciful. So, I don't think it's saying here that he put an end to Job's perseverance. Job remained persevere. He never denied him. We don't see any disobedience which caused his trials, but there was purpose for those trials, and actually it helped Job become more righteous because he endured with perseverance and didn't fail in the attempt to have him curse the Almighty. So we see this example to follow Job, not put an end to his perseverance and not follow him. We should look at that scripture and with teleos and see that we are to strive with perseverance without denying our Creator no matter what trials we go through. As we say in Hebrew, Gam Zula Tova. Right? And we see that in Romans 8:28, that all things work out for good for those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. So everything works out for good if you love him. No matter what kind of trials come upon us, have that perseverance of Job. Job's story is an example for us and a good thing. Let's move on here to 1 Peter chapter 1. Same Greek word here. Verses 8 through 9. I'm going to quote here. "Though now you know you see him. Do you not see him? Yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible." A joy that's just, can't even put words into it. "And full of joy," or glory, verse 9, "receiving the end." Here's that word teleos, Strong's 5056. "The end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. So to say at the end of your faith, is he putting an end to our faith? Well, if he's not putting an end to my faith or your faith, then why would we say he's putting an end to the Torah? Going back to Romans 10:4, same Greek word. That's something to consider. Now, jumping down to verse 13, this Greek word's used again. And I hope you're not getting offended by this, because it is amazing here. Notice in verse 13, wherefore gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and hope to the end. Teleos. For the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Yeshua HaMashiach. Some will say Jesus Christ, but Yeshua HaMashiach, the Messiah, the Messiah. That's Old King James. We don't want to put an end for the grace, right? We don't want to put an end to hope. The hope is our goal, our target for grace. You know, this is what we have to hope for. And so, same Greek word. And of course, many Greek words can be translated in many different ways, and even in opposite ways. Like the word end can be synonymous. It can mean the opposite of what it's intended, based on how we put it into the translation. And this is why I want to encourage you to check up on all expository teachings, messages out there, or interpretations in the context that seem to be very contradictory to the rest of the scriptures, that don't seem to be truly compliant. We should look at, if there's different ways to translate it. I always say I pick the way to translate it that is in compliant. I'm not going to pick an accurate translation or definition of a word that's going to be contradictory. I want to, if there's different ways and opposite ways to interpret it, I'm going to choose the one that is compliant. That's why we have to know the whole book here. If we don't know it all, then we're going to be tricked easily by people who can go and translate words in ways that are not compliant, but teach their own doctrines that way, their own ways that are contrary to his ways. And so if you consider yourself out there to be a Christian, a Christ-ian, a follower of Christ, and proclaim WWJD, what would Jesus do if he was here in the flesh? Well, we have it here for us in many scriptures. He says in Matthew chapter 5:48, he says, therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now your translation might say mature. You shall be mature, just as he is mature. But it's synonymous if we understand it. And I don't think any of us say we're perfect today, but here is the goal. We've got this bullseye to shoot for. And if we fall short, that's where we need grace. But we're trying to hit the bullseye. When I go to archery ranges, if I'm going to shoot an arrow, I'm not going to try to miss the mark. I'm going to try to hit the mark and pray that he'll help me hit that bullseye. I'd like to have his help. And if he's not helping me and I'm trying my best, well, that's where grace comes in. We all need mercy. We all need grace. We all need patience. Absolutely. We can't just be saved by obedience alone. He looks at our heart, our efforts, our relationship with him is all based upon this. But the mindset is to becoming perfect is to continually improve year after year. Just as we become more mature as human beings, putting away childish things and becoming more mature and getting into solid food, not just staying with milk our whole lives, but we need to go and grow and become more and more like him and grow continually the best we can. And he gives a helper, as he says, we see in the Brit Hadashah prophecies in Jeremiah 31:31, as I mentioned earlier, also in Jeremiah 32 about a new spirit writing the laws in our hearts and our minds, the Brit Hadashah, new covenant, and also in Ezekiel, I think is it Ezekiel 11 or 9? I think and Ezekiel 36 talks about this new spirit. We need this spirit, this Ruach HaKodesh, this Holy Spirit, to help us. We can't do it on our own. Continuing here and concluding, ready for the conclusion, same chapter in 1 Peter, continuing on here in verses 14 through 16, he says, as obedient children, doesn't say disobedient or just faith children, but obedience is part of the equation here. Obedient children, as he who called you to be holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. And here, if you want to be living stones, a priesthood, as Peter talks about as he gets into chapter 2 here. And I won't go to chapter 2, but continuing here in verse 16, he says, be holy. He's quoting actually Leviticus. 3 times in Leviticus it says, be holy, for I am holy. And this is what he says. Not Peter's words, not Moses' words, but he's encouraging us to be set apart, to be different for his purposes, to be holy just as he is, to think like him, to become like him. It says that in Leviticus chapter 11:44. Easy number to remember. 1144. And then go to another verse, verse 45. And then the second place in Leviticus 19 verse 2. You'll see the same thing there. Leviticus 20 verse 7. So Leviticus is a book known as for the Levites, Leviticus, but there's many commandments in there that are not just for the Levites. So the encouragement in the book of Leviticus is for all of us to become a priesthood unto him for the world, to be teachers of righteousness, not unrighteousness, and doing away or putting our own commandments and doctrines and traditions and ma'asim or takanot and ma'asim. We need to have his commandments as being higher in authority. I'm not saying tradition is bad. I'm not saying all oral law is bad, or oral commandments, whether it be in Christianity or Judaism. But what I'm saying is when you put things above his commandments and say yours are more important than his, that's standing on dangerous ground. Because he says, be holy as he is holy. In other words, he wants us to become like him. And I hear that a lot in Christianity. Let's be like God. Let's be like him. Well, how do we do that? We have to look at the book. We have to understand obedience is part of it. If you want to be like him, like the Almighty, here's the instructions. That's what Torah means. The literal interpretation is instructions. For it says, be holy, for I am holy. Quoting him.